October 24, 1942. The southern perimeter of Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The battle for Guadalcanal wasn't balanced on grand strategy, it was balanced on a single, muddy airstrip. Every day that American planes took off from that strip was another day. Japan's southern empire was threatened. Another day the lifeline between America and Australia stayed open. For the Allies, it was an unsinkable aircraft carrier. For the Japanese, it was a cancer that had to be cut out. In late October, they were convinced they had one last chance to do it. A massive, coordinated assault to finally drive the Americans into the sea. But this is the story of how that grand plan was built on a foundation of arrogance, and how the jungle, and the men defending it, would teach a brutal lesson in reality. By late 1942, the momentum of the Pacific War was stalling. Japan's string of shocking victories had ended at places like the Coral Sea and Midway. Now the entire strategic balance of the South Pacific was teetering on a single point, Guadalcanal. And on that island, one airfield was the center of gravity for everything. On August 7th, U.S. Marines had seized the partially built Japanese runway, renaming it Henderson Field. From that moment, it was a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan's conquests. It threatened to sever their southern holdings from the empire. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo saw the American presence as weak. They believed a single, powerful blow would shatter them. This wasn't just confidence. It was born from a belief in their own spiritual superiority, and it was reinforced by a dangerous misreading of their own failures. They had already tried to take the field back. In August, a force of about 900 men was annihilated at the Battle of the Tanaru. In September, a much larger force of 6,000 men was bloodily repulsed at Edson's Ridge. But these defeats weren't seen as tactical failures. They were seen as problems of scale. The answer wasn't a new plan, it was just more men. And now, they would commit them. Lieutenant General Harukichi Aikutake, commander of the 17th Army, was sent to personally oversee the final victory. He was so certain of success, he told his staff to start planning the American surrender ceremony. The objective was simple: take Henderson Field. But the plan was built on an assumption that would prove fatal. They believed they understood the battlefield, and they believed they understood their enemy. They were wrong on both counts. General Hayakutake's plan was a masterpiece of complexity on paper. It had two core components, designed to work in perfect synchronization. First, a naval hammer blow. The Imperial Japanese Navy had already shown what it could do. On the night of October 13th-14th, two battleships had sat in Iron Bottom Sound and fired approximately 973 heavy 14-inch shells into the American perimeter. They had wrecked the runways, burned the fuel, and destroyed 48 of the 90 aircraft belonging to the Cactus Air Force. The plan was to do it again, silencing Henderson Field right before the ground attack began. The second component was the ground assault. And this was the ambitious part. The main attack would come from the south, where defenses were believed to be weakest. Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama was tasked with leading thousands of elite troops on a secret 15-mile march through the jungle. They would cut their own path the Maruyama Road to appear behind the Americans in a total surprise. At the same time, a diversionary attack under Major General Tadashi Sumiyoshi would hit the American lines on the Matanikau River to the west, fixing them in place. The whole operation was a clockwork machine. Naval bombardment, diversionary attack, main assault. Each piece timed to the minute, and here's the critical assumption the entire plan rested on: an almost complete ignorance of Guadalcanal itself. Planners in Rabaul looked at a map and saw a jungle. They didn't see the razor-backed ridges, the sucking mud, and the impenetrable vegetation that would turn a road into a green hell. And they assumed the Americans were on the verge of collapse. They failed to understand that the Marines had spent 2 months turning that perimeter into a fortress. They had registered artillery on every approach. They had woven interlocking fields of machine gun fire. The Japanese weren't marching toward a fragile outpost. They were marching, unknowingly, into a killing ground. The plan started to fail almost instantly. The Maruyama Road was a nightmare. Soldiers dragged artillery pieces by hand through torrential rain. The terrain was worse than anyone had imagined. The march took days longer than scheduled. Men were exhausted and starving before they ever saw an enemy. The delay forced the main attack to be postponed to October 24th, and that delay broke the synchronization of the entire plan. Because the diversionary attacks went in on the original schedule, on the night of October 23rd, as Maruyama's main force was still lost in the jungle, 9 Japanese tanks and supporting infantry charged across the sandbar at the mouth of the Matanikau River. They ran directly into the guns of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. The Americans were waiting. 37mm anti-tank guns fired canister rounds. It was a slaughter. Every single tank was destroyed. The diversion had diverted no one. It only served as a bloody announcement that the offensive had begun. Meanwhile, the Navy was sailing in circles waiting for signals from the ground that never came. The land-sea coordination was gone. Finally, on the rainy night of October 24th, Maruyama's exhausted men emerged from the jungle. 2 days late, physically spent, and they were attacking alone. They charged into a wall of American fire. The defense was anchored by Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, and the Army's 164th Infantry Regiment. Japanese soldiers charged in waves, screaming, "Banzai!" and they were mown down in waves by rifles, mortars, and machine guns. The fighting was close. Desperate. In the chaos, one Japanese unit mistakenly reported it had captured the airfield, sending a false wave of euphoria through command before the truth came crashing down. And in the middle of it all, one man's actions showed the difference between the attackers and the defenders. Sergeant Mitchell Page saw a Japanese force overrun a machine gun position, killing or wounding all the other Marines in his section and threatening to break the entire line. Page, alone, moved between 4 different machine guns, keeping up a constant fire. When his last gun was destroyed, he grabbed another, held the hot weapon in his arms, and led a bayonet counterattack that swept the Japanese from the ridge. His action didn't just save a position, it stopped a catastrophic breach. For that, he would receive the Medal of Honor. When the sun came up on October 25th, the price of the failure was written on the ground. The area in front of the American lines was a charnel house, but General Maruyama refused to accept it. That night, his forces attacked again. They clawed their way up the muddy slopes and were cut down again. By the morning of October 26th, it was over. And the arithmetic was brutal. Over 3 days, the Japanese lost between 2,200 and 3,000 men. American dead numbered around 80. For every 1 American killed, Japan lost more than 25 soldiers. The reasons were now crushingly clear. First, the plan had been defeated by the jungle itself. The hellish Maruyama Road had crippled the main attack force before the battle even began. Second, the timetable collapsed. The delays turned coordinated attacks into a series of isolated, suicidal charges. Third, communications failed completely, making a synchronized assault impossible. Fourth, and most critically, they underestimated their enemy. The Marines and Army soldiers were not a fragile force on the brink of collapse. They were well supplied, dug in, and they fought with brutal efficiency. And finally, there was the Cactus Air Force. Henderson Field wasn't just a prize. It was an active combatant. Despite the earlier bombardment, its planes were in the air. They strafed Japanese troop columns, provided reconnaissance, and hunted the supply ships of the Tokyo Express. The field was not just defending itself. It was projecting power that sealed the fate of its attackers. What happened between October 23rd and 26 wasn't just a failed offensive. It was the moment Japan's offensive power on Guadalcanal was broken for good. It was the last major ground attack they would launch on the island. They had gambled their best troops on one final push, and they had lost everything. For the survivors, the campaign became a battle for survival. The dominance of the Cactus Air Force and the U.S. Navy meant resupply was almost impossible. Guadalcanal became known by a new name among the Japanese soldiers: Starvation Island. The land defeat forced a final, desperate gamble at sea. It led directly to the naval Battle of Guadalcanal in November, where the U.S. Navy smashed a Japanese troop convoy and ended any realistic hope of reinforcing the island. In February 1943, the last Japanese troops were evacuated. Securing Guadalcanal didn't just save Australia's lifeline. It gave the Allies the forward base they needed to begin their long march up the Solomon Islands toward the Japanese fortress of Rabaul. The momentum of the war had shifted permanently. The mistake Japan made wasn't in recognizing that Henderson Field was important. The mistake was how they tried to take it. Their plan was a product of victory disease and arrogance born from early victories that made them blind to their own limitations. They believed fighting spirit could conquer a jungle. They believed a complex plan with no margin for error could survive contact with reality. And they believed their enemy was on the verge of breaking. The lesson of Henderson Field is a brutal one. In war, courage is no substitute for coordination, and arrogance is the single most fatal flaw. The quiet that fell over the ridges of Guadalcanal on the morning of October 26th was the sound of the tide of the Pacific War turning for good. The battle for Henderson Field stands as a stark example of how a military operation, no matter how bravely fought, is doomed to fail when it is built on a foundation of flawed assumptions. The Japanese believed one final, brutal push would break the American will. Instead, they broke their own army against the steadfast defense of the U.S. Marines and Army, and the relentless attacks of the Cactus Air Force. This catastrophic miscalculation didn't just cost them a battle, it cost them the entire campaign, and with it, the initiative in the Pacific War. If you found this deep dive into military history engaging, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Let us know in the comments what other pivotal battles you'd like to see us cover. And for those who want to help us continue making these videos, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Thank you for watching.